They fired me in front of the company, and my own aunt stood beside human resources like she had rehearsed my humiliation for years. I thought the worst part was losing my job at the family firm my late father built. I was wrong. The shock came minutes later when the board chair walked in, looked at the forged documents in my aunt's hand, and said my name like a warning. Tell me where you are watching from and stay with me because everything changed forever after that. My name is Nora Vale, and until that morning, I still believed blood made people softer with each other. I know that sounds naive. Maybe it was. But when you grow up in a family business, you are trained to confuse sacrifice with loyalty. My father started Vale Restoration Group with one pickup truck, 2 employees, and a reputation for doing honest structural repair after storms, fires, and insurance disasters. By the time I was old enough to understand invoices and client trust, that little company had become a respected regional operation with commercial contracts, municipal bids, and a private consulting division that handled high-value recovery cases. My father used to say a family company survived only if the family remembered the company did not belong to their feelings. It belonged to the work. Then he died. A stroke. Sudden. Brutal. One week he was lecturing project managers about change orders and ethics. The next week I was standing in a funeral dress while relatives I had barely seen in years hugged me too tightly and looked past me at the office building across the street from the church. After his death, control shifted faster than grief could settle. My Aunt Patricia, his older sister, stepped in as interim chief executive because she had been on the board and had managed administrative operations years earlier. My cousin Grant, her son, was promoted into executive oversight, even though everyone knew he had never stuck with anything longer than it took to impress the right person. My younger sister Elise, who never wanted any part of construction or finance, was pulled close to Patricia with the soft language of protection. I was kept in operations and compliance, which sounded important because it was important. It just was not powerful enough to stop what came next. At first, the changes arrived disguised as modernization. Patricia replaced our longtime outside accountant with a private firm recommended by one of Grant's friends. She moved vendor approval authority away from department managers and centralized it through executive review. She pushed through a policy that required all legal inquiries, insurance escalations, and claim disputes to be routed through her office. She said the company needed tighter discipline. She said my father had built with instinct, but growth demanded structure. When I asked for clearer documentation, she smiled at me the way adults smile at a child who has misunderstood a room. Then came the smaller insults. The kind that sound petty when you say them out loud, but they pile up until they form a cage. I was left out of budget meetings I used to run. My reports were circulated without my name. Grant would present my risk findings in board prep sessions as if he had discovered them himself, then make jokes about how I was good with details because I did not have the personality for leadership. Patricia never corrected him. She would tilt her head and say things like, "Nora is reliable and we need reliable people." Reliable was how they buried me alive. The first hard crack in the picture showed up in a disaster recovery contract for a school district west of Columbus. I remember the date only by weather. There had been freezing rain all morning and the whole city looked like it had been sealed in glass. I was reviewing a batch of emergency procurement files when I noticed that one subcontractor, Holloway Site Services, had billed twice for demolition labor on overlapping dates at different locations with the same crew list. That can happen by error if paperwork is sloppy. It becomes something else when the signatures match down to the pressure marks and the approval chain runs through the same executive account. I flagged it and sent it to Grant. He replied 6 hours later with one sentence, "Handled, do not duplicate review." I did not answer. I pulled 6 more files, then 12, then the previous quarter. The pattern spread like mold once I knew where to look. Inflated equipment rentals. Repeat vendor payments under slightly altered entity names. Consulting fees to shell corporations with mailing addresses tied to a co-working office and no visible staff. Asset transfers involving a warehouse parcel my father had intended to place in trust for future expansion. That parcel had quietly been leveraged, then reassigned through a holding company connected to Patricia. I sat in my office past midnight with stacks of printed ledgers and a legal pad covered in arrows, circles, and names. My hands were shaking, but not from fear yet. At that stage, it was disbelief fighting to stay alive. The next morning, I brought my concerns to Martin Cross, our general counsel. Martin had worked with my father for years. He was careful, polished, and maddeningly calm. I thought if anyone would tell me I was missing context, it would be him. Instead, he read in silence for 10 minutes, closed the file, and asked who else had seen it. Just me, I said. He leaned back and looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before. Then he said, "You need to move carefully." That was not reassurance, that was a warning. I asked him directly whether Patricia was stealing from the company my father built. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He asked me whether I trusted my family to behave rationally if money and legacy were on the line. I left his office colder than I entered it. That afternoon, Patricia called me into the executive conference room. Grant was there. So was Elise, which made no operational sense. My aunt folded her hands on top of a leather binder and told me that several department heads had raised concerns about my professionalism. She said I had been disruptive, emotional, and resistant to strategic leadership. Grant added that I had created confusion by challenging approved financial workflows that I did not fully understand. Elise would not meet my eyes. I asked whether this meeting was disciplinary. Patricia smiled. That smile still visits me in bad dreams. She said, "Nora, this is a family conversation." That sentence taught me more about betrayal than any legal filing ever could. Whenever someone in a powerful family says something is a family conversation, it usually means they want the protection of intimacy without the accountability of process. I asked Elise why she was there. Patricia answered for her, "Because she matters." That was when I understood the favoritism was not accidental. Patricia had decided which women in this family deserved tenderness and which one could be fed to the wolves. Elise was fragile, agreeable, and easy to mold. I was inconvenient because I kept records. Over the next 2 weeks, the pressure intensified. My access to archived finance folders was restricted. A project coordinator I had mentored suddenly filed a complaint claiming I had intimidated staff over document requests. Human Resources opened a review into my conduct. Grant began forwarding me on emails where he corrected my tone in front of junior employees. Patricia started calling me unstable in language polished enough to avoid legal exposure. She told one board member I was still grieving and had developed obsessive attachments to my father's old systems. She told another that I was confusing routine restructuring with misconduct because I could not accept changing roles. Then Martin stopped returning my calls. I should have known that meant he had chosen survival. The last piece clicked into place when a longtime vendor, a woman named Dana Ruiz, asked to meet off-site. Dana had supplied restoration materials to our company since before I finished college. She was blunt smart and impossible to flatter. We met at a diner outside town, the kind with burnt coffee and honest pie. She slid me a copy of a payment request that carried my digital approval. I had never seen it. The document authorized release of retained funds to a contractor who had already been paid in full, then redirected a portion into an asset recovery account tied to one of Patricia's holding entities. My name was there, my employee credentials, my approval stamp. Even the timing made sense within my normal workflow. I felt sick. Donna looked at me and said, "I knew you did not sign this because your father taught you never to release funds without field confirmation." Patricia forgot that some of us remember how he trained people. Fraud, direct and deliberate, not just embezzlement, not just asset seizure. They were building a paper trail that could pin the theft on me if anyone started asking questions. My exclusion from meetings was not disrespect alone. It was choreography. They were isolating me, discrediting me, then loading false approvals under my identity. I went back to the office with a copy of that document in my bag and a pulse so loud I could hear it in my ears. Before I could reach my desk, Human Resources intercepted me and asked me to come upstairs. They used those gentle voices people use when they are preparing something violent behind glass. The entire senior staff was gathered near reception. Patricia stood at the center, serene as church marble. Grant held a folder. Human Resources announced that I was being terminated for misconduct, unauthorized financial activity, and creating a hostile work environment during an active internal review. People stared at the floor. A few looked shocked. Most looked relieved it was not them. My aunt took the folder from Grant. and held up copies of forged approvals with my name across the bottom. Then she said loudly enough for half the office to hear, "We tried to protect her because she is family." That sentence landed like acid. In one breath, she stole from my father, used my identity to cover it, and cast herself as the merciful relative forced to do the hard thing. She wanted disgrace to stick to me in public because public humiliation changes how later truth is received. If people first see you as unstable, every defense sounds desperate. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could speak, the glass doors at the far end of the floor swung open. Board chair. Eleanor Whitmore stepped inside with two outside directors, a forensic auditor, and Martin Cross walking half a step behind them, like a man who had just realized caution had an expiration date. Eleanor looked at the papers in my aunt's hand, then at Patricia, and then she said my name like a warning. The room went still, in the way rooms do when power changes owners, before anyone has time to stand up straighter. Eleanor Whitmore was not dramatic by nature, which made her presence more frightening than any outburst could have. She had served on the board since before I was born, and my father respected her in the rare way he reserved for people who could disagree with him without performing it. She was old school in the sharpest sense. Quiet voice, ruthless memory, no patience for vanity disguised as strategy. When she said my name, she did not say it with comfort. She said it with precision, like she was placing a marker in the middle of a battlefield. Patricia lowered the papers by half an inch. Grant tried to recover, first stepping forward with the eager confidence of a man who had no idea he was already standing on a trap door. "Chair Whitmore," he said, "we are in the middle of an internal personnel matter." Eleanor did not look at him. "No," she said. "You are in the middle of interfering with an active forensic review." You could feel the temperature in the office change, not emotionally, literally. People stopped moving, the sound drained out, and every humming light overhead suddenly felt too loud. Patricia drew herself up and tried on injured authority. "I requested no such review." Eleanor finally turned her gaze to her. "I know. That is one of several reasons we are here. I had imagined exposure 100 different ways in my head after finding the fake approval Dana showed me. In every version, truth arrived slowly and cruelly. A motion? A memo. A private legal process that would stretch for months while my reputation bled out in the parking lot. I had not imagined this. I had not imagined the board walking in during my public firing. I had not imagined the timing being so exact it felt almost biblical. The forensic auditor, a compact woman with silver-framed glasses and a hard expression, asked Human Resources to pause all termination processing effective immediately. She said every physical and digital record related to executive financial approvals, property transfers, vendor disbursements, and personnel complaints was now under preservation order. Nobody was to delete, alter, move, or access files without written authorization from counsel and the board committee. Patricia laughed. It was a bad move. Too airy. Too practiced. "This is absurd," she said. "Nora has been disruptive for weeks. She has accused this family of crimes because she cannot accept professional correction." Eleanor answered her without raising her voice. "We did not begin this inquiry because of Nora. That mattered. It mattered more than I can explain, because Patricia had built her whole defense on the idea that I was a grieving daughter seeing ghosts in spreadsheets. If the investigation started somewhere else, her story cracked wide open." Martin finally spoke, his face pale. "A routine external review flagged inconsistencies in retained earnings transfers and project reserve allocations. Once independent counsel expanded the scope, they found links to unauthorized entities and asset movement patterns requiring immediate board action." He sounded formal, but I could hear the shame underneath it. He had known enough to fear this and not enough courage to stand up until the board forced the door open. Grant tried to interrupt. "Those allocations were executive decisions approved under restructuring authority." The auditor looked at him. She asked, "Are you referring to the authority you assigned yourself through the amended operating memo that bears a duplicate signature block copied from a dead shareholder file?" No one breathed. That was the first clean cut. Public, specific, impossible to spin. Patricia took one step back, only one, but I saw it. Eleanor asked me to remain where I was. Then she asked Donna Ruiz to come forward from the hallway. I had not even known Dana was there. She entered holding a document folder, and the kind of expression people wear when they are done helping powerful families lie to themselves. Eleanor explained that Dana had approached an outside director after noticing vendor payment irregularities attached to my credentials. She had refused to process certain release instructions because they violated long-standing controls established by my father. Her report triggered the first independent review. Patricia looked at me with something uglier than anger. It was irritation that her timing had failed. Dana handed the auditor copies of payment demands release notices and revised approval sheets showing parallel submissions from different executive channels. Some used my identity. Some used project managers who were out on medical leave when the authorizations were supposedly made. One involved a property lien filing connected to the expansion parcel my father intended to reserve for future development. Another routed cleanup equipment leases through a shell company registered to a trust administrator who also handled Patricia's private holdings. The auditor spoke with brutal clarity. We have evidence of falsified approvals, unauthorized diversion of company funds, misrepresentation of corporate assets, and document manipulation designed to obscure origin and control. Grant turned to Patricia too fast. He should not have done that either. It told the room where his instructions came from. He recovered by pointing at me. She had access. She handled compliance. She could have buried anything and blamed us when it surfaced. Eleanor looked at him the way surgeons look at tissue that has to be removed. She said your private messages were preserved before your account privileges were limited this morning. That was the second cut. I did not know then how much they already had. Later, I learned an information security consultant hired by the board had quietly mirrored executive correspondence after 2 internal alerts suggested file tampering. Grant had spent weeks mocking operations staff in messages bragging that Nora would make a convincing scapegoat because she was emotional enough to be believable and careful enough to have access everywhere. He joked that all families needed one daughter who still thought principles were legal tender. Patricia never wrote anything that explicit, but she replied often enough to leave a trail. Refine the narrative. Keep Elise separate. Do not let Nora get in front of the board. Human resources needs to move sooner. There it was, not just theft, strategy. The family betrayal hurt in layers. The money was ugly, yes. The asset seizure made me furious. But the deepest wound was discovering that while I was still trying to protect the company from scandal, they were privately engineering a story where I became the scandal. Elise finally spoke. She did it in a small voice from the edge of the room, but it cut through everything, because it carried the weight of someone the family had designated harmless. Is it true, she asked Patricia, that you moved Dad's warehouse parcel into your holding company? Nobody corrected her use of Dad. In our family, people blurred those titles when it helped them borrow grief. Patricia turned with immediate softness. Elise, sweetheart, this is not the time. Elise started crying. Grant muttered under his breath for her to stop. That was when I realized she had not known the whole thing. She had been pulled in, favored, shielded, and used, but not fully trusted. Patricia had counted on that. Keep one daughter close enough to look loyal, but ignorant enough to be sincere on camera. Keep the other isolated enough to blame. Eleanor instructed security to escort Patricia and Grant to separate conference rooms, pending counsel interviews. Patricia objected, loudly this time. She called the process defamatory. She accused the board of humiliating a grieving family. She said outsiders were exploiting private conflict. For one dangerous second, I thought some people in the room might still believe her because powerful women who cry at the right moment can redirect whole narratives. Then the auditor placed one final document on the reception desk. It was a draft severance packet prepared in advance for me, complete with a non-disclosure clause release of claims and a statement that I accepted termination based on policy violations. The signature date field had been pre-filled for that morning before Human Resources had even called me upstairs. Predetermined, not disciplinary, not investigative, staged. The entire office could see it. The whisper that moved through that floor did more damage to Patricia than any accusation. People understand corruption in theory. What they never forgive is theater at their expense. Everyone standing there realized they had just been used as an audience for a lie. Human Resources backed away from Patricia so quickly it was almost comical. One manager asked whether she needed independent counsel. Another suddenly remembered there had been concerns about document authenticity in prior complaint files. Cowards always discover their conscience near the safest exit. I should have felt triumphant. I did not. Not yet. My knees were weak and my heart was hammering with the delayed shock of seeing my private nightmare dragged into fluorescent light. I was vindicated, but I was also standing in the wreckage of the last belief I had about family. Patricia had not simply chosen money over me. She had chosen to destroy me publicly in order to keep control. That kind of choice does not grow in a moment. It grows in the dark over years. As security moved Patricia and Grant away, she twisted once and looked straight at me. "This would have been easier," she said, "if you had known your place." There it was. Not strategy, not law, not restructuring. The heart of it, contempt. Not for my mistakes, for my refusal to stay small. Eleanor heard it too. She closed her folder and said for the whole room to hear, "The board will be reviewing all governance failures that allowed this conduct to continue, including retaliation against Ms. Vale." Ms. Vale. Not Nora, the grieving daughter. Not family, not a problem. A person with standing. That formal distance saved me more than affection could have in that moment. By late afternoon, my termination had been voided. Executive access had been frozen outside. Council had assumed control of relevant records, and a special board session had been called for the next morning. News had not gone public yet, but inside the company, the story was already splitting open. People I had not heard from in months started sending careful messages. Some apologized for staying quiet. Some offered records. Some wanted to know whether they were at risk. I answered almost none of them. Dana sat with me in an unused office while I stared at the wall and tried to understand why vindication could feel so much like grief. She handed me a bottle of water and said, "This is not over." People like Patricia do not collapse when cornered. They look for one more person to drag down with them. She was right, because exposure is not the end of a family war. Exposure is only the moment when the masks come off and everyone chooses in public who they are willing to become. And by that night, I would learn that some of the people stepping toward me with sympathy had not decided to help me. They had only decided to stand closer to the winning side until the ground shifted again. That night did not bring relief. It brought silence thick enough to feel like pressure against my ribs. Exposure had cracked the surface, but underneath it, the structure of the company and the family still trembled in ways no one could yet predict. I understood something clearly as I sat alone in my apartment with untouched food and a phone lighting up with careful messages. Truth alone would not protect me. Evidence had opened the door, but people would decide how far that door stayed open. The next morning, the board convened an emergency session. I was asked to attend not as a daughter, not as a victim, but as head of compliance reinstated under temporary authority. That distinction mattered. It meant I was expected to speak in facts, not pain. Eleanor Whitmore began the meeting with a tone that stripped all illusion from the room. She stated that the company was facing potential civil liability, regulatory scrutiny, and reputational collapse if the misconduct was not contained with precision and transparency. She outlined 3 immediate priorities: secure all financial records, identify the full scope of asset diversion, and determine internal complicity beyond Patricia and Grant. That last part echoed. Internal complicity. It meant the board already suspected what I had started to fear. Patricia had not operated alone. Not entirely. I presented my findings in sequence. No dramatics, no commentary, just patterns. Duplicate vendor billing shell entity, routing falsified approvals under my credentials and asset transfers tied to holding companies connected to Patricia. I added Dana's documents, cross-referenced timelines, and flagged the property parcel that had been quietly leveraged. When I finished, the room was quiet in a different way than the day before. This was not shock. This was calculation. One board member, a former regulator named Thomas Hale, leaned forward and asked me a question that cut deeper than any accusation Patricia had made. "Why did you not escalate this sooner?" "It was fair, brutal but fair." I told him the truth. Because the system I trusted to receive escalation had already been reshaped to protect the person I would have reported. He held my gaze for a long second, then nodded once. That was the first moment I felt something shift in my favor that had nothing to do with family and everything to do with credibility. After the meeting, alliances began forming, but not in obvious ways. Donna became my anchor outside the company. She connected me with two other vendors who had refused irregular payment instructions and had quietly documented inconsistencies over the past months. One had been threatened with contract termination. The other had been delayed on payment until they complied with altered billing formats. Both agreed to provide statements under legal protection. Inside, the company support was more complicated. Martin Cross approached me in a hallway with the same controlled tone he always used, but something inside him had fractured. He admitted he had seen warning signs earlier, but believed he could manage them internally without triggering a board crisis. He said he underestimated Patricia's willingness to cross legal lines. I did not forgive him, not then, but I listened. He offered access to archived legal correspondence and internal audit drafts that had been halted without formal closure. Those files became critical. They showed early attempts to question discrepancies that had been quietly redirected or buried under procedural delays. Then there was Elise. She came to my apartment late that evening, eyes swollen, voice unsteady. For the first time since all of this began, she looked at me without the filter Patricia had placed between us. I did not know, she said. I believed her. Not because I wanted to, but because ignorance had been carefully curated around her. Patricia had kept her close enough to appear loyal, but far enough from the mechanics of fraud. Elise told me something that changed everything. She had been asked to sign off on a family trust adjustment weeks earlier. Patricia framed it as estate planning, something to protect long-term stability after our father's death. Elise signed without reading closely. She trusted the explanation. That document, it turned out, connected to the same holding structure that had absorbed the warehouse parcel. Patricia had used Elise as a clean signature. That meant we now had proof of asset seizure not only through corporate channels, but through family trust manipulation. Elise broke down when she realized what she had been part of. I am the reason she could do it, she said. No, I told her. You are the reason we can prove it. That was the moment she became more than a bystander. She became part of the case. Still, alliances are never clean. Some employees who reached out to me did so with sincerity. Others did so with calculation. I had to learn quickly how to tell the difference. People who had stayed silent during my public firing now wanted to share small pieces of information, as if that could erase their earlier absence. I accepted what was useful and ignored what was performative. Then came Daniel Reyes. He was a senior project manager who had worked under my father for years. Quiet, disciplined, and known for walking away from deals that smelled wrong. He asked to meet privately, not in the office, not through email. We met in a parking garage after hours, which would have felt dramatic if the situation had not already passed that threshold. Daniel handed me a flash drive. I copied internal scheduling logs and equipment movement records, he said. Something did not match billing reports. I did not know what, but I knew it was wrong. When I reviewed the files later, I realized what he had uncovered. Equipment listed as deployed on multiple sites simultaneously. Labor hours duplicated across projects. Timelines that proved certain work billed as completed had never actually occurred. It was not just financial manipulation. It was systemic falsification tied to operational reporting. Daniel became a key ally after that. Not loud, not visible, but precise. As the network grew, so did the tension. Patricia's legal team began pushing back aggressively. They filed objections to document access, challenged the scope of the investigation, and attempted to frame the situation as internal mismanagement exaggerated by a grieving daughter and opportunistic vendors. Grant's messages had weakened their position, but they were not done. And then came the first sign that our alliances were not as solid as they seemed. A document I had shared only within a small circle appeared in a legal filing from Patricia's side, twisted and reframed to suggest that I had been aware of discrepancies earlier and failed to act. Someone had leaked it. The realization landed slowly, then all at once. The network I was building to expose the truth had already been compromised. And I had no idea which of the people standing beside me had decided to sell me out. That was when suspense stopped being abstract. It became personal, because betrayal inside a family is devastating. But betrayal inside the group you are trusting to survive that family can destroy you completely. And I had just stepped into that second kind without realizing it. The moment I saw that document in Patricia's legal filing, I felt something inside me go still. Not panic, not anger, recognition. Because betrayal does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives dressed as cooperation, carrying your own words back to you with just enough distortion to make you look guilty. The document they used was not random. It was a draft summary I had created outlining the timeline of discovered discrepancies and internal responses. It included my early hesitation, my delayed escalation, and my attempts to verify patterns before raising formal accusations. In the wrong context, it could be twisted into negligence. Only a handful of people had access to it: Dana, Daniel, Martin, Elise, and one more, Lydia Shaw. I had almost forgotten about her, which in hindsight was the first mistake. Lydia was part of the internal audit support team recently brought in during Patricia's restructuring phase. She was sharp, observant, and unusually attentive to my work once the investigation began. She asked precise questions, offered to help organize records, and positioned herself as someone who understood both compliance and internal politics. I trusted her faster than I should have. When I called an emergency meeting with the core group, I did not accuse anyone directly. I laid out the fact that a controlled document had been leaked and reframed. I watched their reactions carefully. Dana was furious openly and without restraint. Daniel went quiet in the way he always did when processing risk. Elise looked confused and hurt. Martin closed his eyes briefly as if calculating damage. Lydia looked concerned. Too concerned. She asked the right questions, used the right tone, even suggested tightening document access protocols moving forward. If I had not been paying attention, I might have missed it. But betrayal leaves patterns just like fraud does. And Lydia's pattern was too clean. I started retracing access logs that night. Not just who had the document, but when it had been opened, copied, or transferred. Information security had already restricted most systems, but fragments remained. That was when I found it. A late-night access timestamp tied to Lydia's credentials, followed by a brief external data transfer flagged, but not escalated because it fell just under the alert threshold. She had taken it. But that alone was not enough. I needed to understand why. The answer came faster than I expected. The next morning, I received a notice from Patricia's legal team requesting my presence for a formal deposition. Attached to it was a statement indicating that an internal audit specialist had provided testimony supporting concerns about my handling of financial discrepancies prior to escalation. They did not name her. They did not have to. Lydia had not just leaked documents. She had aligned herself with Patricia. The realization did not break me the way I might have expected. It clarified everything. Lydia was not random. She had been placed. Patricia had anticipated resistance. She had built not only financial structures but human ones. Lydia's role was not to manage audits, it was to monitor, report, and intervene if necessary. And I had walked straight into it. The deposition was scheduled quickly, almost aggressively. Patricia's team wanted to regain control of the narrative before the board could finalize its findings. When I walked into that room, I saw Lydia sitting across from me. She did not look ashamed, she looked prepared. Patricia's attorney began by establishing a timeline designed to frame me as inconsistent, reactive, and emotionally driven. They presented the leaked document highlighting my delayed escalation as evidence of poor judgment. Then they introduced Lydia's testimony. Lydia spoke calmly. She said she had observed me struggling to separate personal grief from professional responsibility. She said I had expressed doubts but failed to act decisively. She suggested that my actions or lack of them created an environment where discrepancies could grow unchecked. It was precise, measured, damaging. For a brief moment, the room tilted, not because I believed her, but because I understood how convincing she sounded. This was the temporary defeat Dana had warned me about. Truth does not always win immediately. Sometimes it gets buried under better storytelling. By the time the deposition ended, Patricia's team had something they could use. Not enough to clear her, not enough to stop the investigation, but enough to muddy the narrative and slow everything down. Outside, the air felt heavier. Elise was waiting for me, eyes searching for reassurance I did not yet have. "Did we lose?" she asked. I shook my head slowly. "Not yet." But for the first time since the board stepped in, I felt the ground shift beneath me. Daniel called later that evening. "You need to assume everything Lydia touched is compromised," he said. He was right. Files, communications, strategy. We had built part of our case with someone who was feeding information to the other side. That meant Patricia knew more than she should, which meant she was already planning her next move. And we were behind again. That night, I sat alone with every document spread across my table, every connection mapped out in lines that now felt unstable. For all the evidence we had gathered, one thing became painfully clear. We had been reacting. Patricia had been anticipating. And now, because I trusted the wrong person at the wrong time, she had regained just enough control to make this fight longer, messier, and far more dangerous. Temporary defeat does not feel temporary when you are inside it. It feels like the beginning of collapse. But somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the anger, something else started to take shape. Not hope. Not yet. Something sharper. Understanding. Because betrayal, when it repeats, stops being shocking. It becomes a pattern you can finally learn to break. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If Lydia thought she had ended this for me, she had misunderstood who she chose to betray. The night after the deposition, I stopped trying to fix what had already been compromised. Instead, I started asking a different question. What had Patricia not anticipated? Because Lydia's betrayal made one thing painfully clear. Everything predictable had already been accounted for. Internal reports, compliance channels, audit support, even emotional pressure points. Patricia had mapped all of it. So the only way forward was to step outside her map. The answer came from someone I had not considered an ally at all. Thomas Hale, the same board member who had asked me why I did not escalate sooner. He requested a private meeting, not at the office, not through counsel, but at a quiet legal conference space downtown. When I arrived, he was already there reviewing documents with a precision that felt almost surgical. He did not waste time. Your case is strong, he said, but it is fragmented. Patricia's defense is exploiting gaps in continuity, not gaps in truth. That distinction mattered more than anything Lydia had said. He explained that while we had evidence of fraud, asset diversion, and falsification, it was being presented in pieces. Patricia's team was isolating each piece and reframing it as misunderstanding, mismanagement, or delayed oversight. What we needed was a chain, not just proof. An unbroken sequence that showed intent, execution, and concealment as one continuous act. That was when he introduced the missing element, banking oversight. Through regulatory connections, Hale had quietly obtained flagged transaction reports tied to corporate accounts associated with Vail Restoration Group. These were not internal records Patricia could manipulate. These were external compliance alerts triggered by unusual fund movements across linked entities. And they connected everything. Vendor overpayments routed through shell companies transferring funds into holding entities securing assets originally owned by the company. It was not just fraud anymore. It was a closed loop, self-feeding, self-concealing. Indisputable. But the most critical piece came last: digital authentication logs. Hale's team had worked with an external forensic technology firm to reconstruct access patterns tied to executive-level approvals. Not just who approved documents, but where, when, and from what device. The forged approvals under my name, they were not just falsified. They were executed through a remote access point linked to a private network registered under one of Patricia's personal assets. That was the break, because it did not just prove fraud. It proved deliberate impersonation, which turned everything from internal misconduct into criminal exposure. I sat there staring at the reconstructed timeline as it unfolded in perfect clarity. Every piece I had fought to gather suddenly locked into place, and for the first time since this began, I felt something stronger than anger. Certainty. Hale looked at me and said something I will never forget. Justice is not about having the truth. It is about proving that the truth cannot be denied. We had that now, but we still needed to move carefully, because Patricia was not finished. The board scheduled a final evidentiary session, one that would determine not only internal consequences, but whether the case would be referred for criminal prosecution. In the days leading up to it, pressure intensified again. Patricia's legal team shifted tone, attempting to negotiate partial accountability in exchange for limiting public exposure. Grant's counsel began positioning him as manipulated, inexperienced, and secondary. And Lydia, she disappeared. No responses, no appearances, no statements beyond her deposition. It did not matter anymore. Her role had been to disrupt. Now she was irrelevant. The day of the hearing, the room felt different from every meeting before it. This was not investigation. This was conclusion. Hale presented first, laying out the financial chain in a sequence so clear it removed all ambiguity. Then the forensic technology team demonstrated the authentication logs mapping the exact moments where my credentials had been used from unauthorized locations. Patricia tried to interrupt, tried to reframe, tried to regain control of the narrative one last time. But this time there was no space left for interpretation. Every word she spoke now collided with evidence that did not bend. And then unexpectedly Elise stood up. No one had planned for that. Her voice shook, but she did not stop. She admitted signing the trust document. She explained how it had been presented to her. She described the pressure, the framing, the emotional manipulation that made her believe she was protecting the family. And then she said something that changed everything. I trusted her because she told me Nora was the only risk to this family. Silence. Complete. Final. That statement did not just expose fraud. It exposed intent. Divide, isolate, control. Patricia had not just stolen money. She had engineered the destruction of one daughter to secure the loyalty of another. There was nothing left to defend. By the time Elise sat down, the outcome was already decided. The board moved to immediate action, and this time there would be no delays, no negotiations, no more control, because the truth was no longer fragile. It was absolute, and nothing Patricia had built could survive it. The collapse did not feel dramatic. It felt inevitable. Within hours of the final session, Patricia was removed from all executive authority, her board privileges revoked, and her access to company systems permanently terminated. Grant followed his position dissolved under findings of direct involvement and willful participation. But the real consequences moved beyond the company. The case was formally referred for criminal investigation. Fraud, financial manipulation, identity misuse, asset seizure. Not allegations anymore. Charges. Patricia tried one last time to control the narrative through public statements, framing herself as a misunderstood leader targeted by internal conflict and opportunistic actors. But this time the response did not come from me. It came from the evidence, and from the people she had underestimated. Dinah provided sworn vendor testimony. Daniel submitted operational records that confirmed systemic falsification. Hale ensured regulatory bodies had full access to the financial chain. And Elise chose truth, even when it meant breaking the version of family she had been taught to protect. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. Not suddenly, but completely. The company entered a restructuring phase under direct board supervision. External auditors rebuilt financial transparency from the ground up. Policies were rewritten not just to prevent fraud, but to prevent silence. As for me, I was offered a choice: return quietly to my previous role, or step into leadership during the rebuild. For the first time, I did not feel like I was inheriting something. I felt like I was choosing it. I accepted. Not for the legacy, not for the family name, but for the work my father believed in, and for the version of myself I almost lost trying to protect people who never intended to protect me. Elise and I did not fix everything. That kind of damage does not disappear. But we rebuilt something honest, not based on blind loyalty, not based on obligation, based on truth. And that made it stronger than anything we had before. As for Lydia, I eventually learned she had aligned with Patricia in exchange for career advancement and financial incentives tied to the restructuring phase Patricia believed she would control. When that future collapsed, so did her position. Some betrayals do not need revenge. They carry their own ending. And Patricia, the last time I saw her was in a courtroom hallway. She looked smaller, not weaker. Just exposed. She did not speak to me. She did not need to. Because everything she had tried to take from me had already returned in a way she could never control again. That is the thing about karma. It does not rush. It waits until the truth is undeniable. And then it arrives all at once. If you have ever been told to stay quiet to protect your family, I want to ask you something. Who was protecting you? If this story meant something to you, share your experience below. I read every comment because stories like this are never just stories. They are lessons we carry forward. Like this video if you believe truth matters more than appearances. Subscribe if you want more stories where justice does not just exist, it arrives. And share this with someone who needs to remember that silence is not loyalty. Thank you for staying with me through this. And wherever you are, I hope you never forget this. The right family is not always the one you are born into. It is the one that stands with you when truth finally speaks.